May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I want to thank all of you for tuning in on your digital device to our worship this morning. I always wondered how it would feel to be a televangelist. I expect this is the closest I will get, but it allows me to imagine the great crowd of witnesses out there, so it's good to be with you, even if we have to do it digitally. In these days of COVID-19, I've been reflecting on The Walking Dead. Though I'm not a regular viewer of the TV show The Walking Dead, I am fascinated by its appeal and success. It's spun off many movies and other TV shows. The show is now in its 10th season, and the concept of the storyline is that there has been a devastating zombie pandemic, an apocalypse, and people are turned into the walking dead. A group of survivors search for safety and security as they attempt to keep from becoming zombies themselves. And my question this morning is, what is it about this show that taps into our psyches and our unconscious? What is it? Could it be that we are simply afraid to die, or perhaps even worse, we're afraid of being alive, but feeling like the walking dead, like we are dead in our souls? I was in college at the University of Virginia at the height of the Vietnam War. I remember a young man by the name of Chris who had been a GI. He had been a private in Vietnam, but had been wounded and received a medical discharge. He was in several of my classes, and we became friends. I remember talking to Chris late into the night one night, as college students do. We talked about the casualties of the war and about how the war was being protested more and more. Chris had participated in much of the heavy fighting, and it was obvious from his comments that he had seen too much death and destruction and at an early age, and it had aged him far beyond his years. Referring to the death that he had seen, he said near the end of our conversation, and this is the quote as much as I can remember it, "The thought that the end of my life will be a hole in the ground, 6 feet long and 6 feet deep, casts a shadow over everything else I do." I think about his ominous words from time to time, and especially these past few weeks as we have faced COVID-19. Though Chris had done many an heroic act during the war, he was still afraid. He was afraid of death. A poet once said, "Death in itself is nothing, but we fear to be we know not what, and we know not where." We fear the vast unknown beyond this life and the gate of death. We clergy spend more time than most dealing with death. Funerals and grief work are all a part of the routine for us, and we begin to lull ourselves into the belief that we are strong and can be untouched by it. Then something will happen that will shake us up too. My father died 15 years ago, but his birthday is coming up soon. A few years ago, I was in a drugstore buying a birthday card for a friend, and I strangely found myself wondering which card I would buy if I were going to send my father a birthday card that year. It was at that moment that I realized I was still grieving to some extent. I fled the store before anyone could see the tears that were welling up in my eyes. No one is immune from the ravages of death. Jesus knew this. Today's gospel lesson shows that to be true of Jesus. Today we hear of the fascinating story of the raising of Lazarus, the great friend to Jesus. Lazarus is sick and apparently near death. His sisters, Martha and Mary, come to fetch Jesus because they know that he can heal him if he can just get there in time. But Jesus takes his time. In fact, he seems to waste time getting there. Lollygag and dilly-dally are the terms we use around our house for this. Jesus was lollygagging until it is certain that Lazarus is dead, and only then does he go into action. When he arrives at the tomb of the dead man's family and his friends are there weeping, Jesus is not unaffected by the death of his friend. Jesus wept, the gospel says. This is one of the shortest verses of the New Testament, but it's still filled with meaning. I believe Jesus wept because he was in grief, as many of us are in grief. He also wept because he could see how destructive death is to the human soul. He could see how painful death is and how it touches every facet of our lives. He could see the sorrow which we suffer at the hand of death and how it distorts our life with God. And then Jesus does something absolutely amazing. Roll away the stone, he commands. Martha, always the practical and down-to-earth sister, points out that he has been dead for 4 days. There will be an odor. The King James Version said, he stinketh. I always liked that when I was a young child. He stinketh. Nonetheless, the stone is rolled away. Jesus prays to God and cries out, Lazarus, come out. And to the amazement of everyone there, and to our own amazement, the man walks out of the tomb, once dead, but now alive again. What is the meaning of this resurrection story as we hear it just 2 weeks before Jesus' own crucifixion and resurrection? To my mind, the unmistakable truth is that no matter where Jesus is and no matter what he is doing, he brings life. Jesus brings us life. The raising of Lazarus from the dead reveals the truth that Jesus has come to teach us, that we're not just slowly dying in this life. We aren't in the thralls of anything, including COVID. We are being taught to live, even now, even ever more joyfully and ever more abundantly. He teaches us that life in his name and through his Spirit is freeing to our spirits. Let's face it, we spend some days closer to death than to life. We live sometimes with the nagging sense that there is something more to life than what we are experiencing and that we are not completely alive. The sparkle of life gets tarnished and we grow weary. We are drawn into that ever-present inertia of death. The story of Lazarus coming to life after he has been dead is a reminder of how Jesus works in our lives. Jesus is not powerless against the powers of death. This is the reminder of the great New Testament promise that one day we will be united with all those we love once more. And just as Jesus calls Lazarus out of the tomb into new life, so too does he call us out of our tombs. Wherever Jesus is, there is life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life, he says to us. The story of Lazarus is our story. Whenever we are faltering, whenever we are a step away from spiritual death, whenever we get the feeling that life just does not matter anymore, at that point, Jesus invites us to a new way of thinking. He commands us to come out of our tombs. He sets us free. The same Christ who brought Lazarus from the dead is still in the resurrection business. So let it be for you. So let it be for me. Amen.